The late afternoon sun shimmered softly across the quiet suburb of Kingsfield. Jasmine Crockett, wearing a beige trench coat and her hair tied neatly back, walked calmly down the sidewalk. She held a worn-out cloth bag with the fading words, "Speak truth even if your voice shakes," printed across the front. She wasn't dressed like a politician. No heels, no congressional badge. Just a regular woman running errands after a long week in Washington. She had been looking forward to this moment of stillness. No meetings, no cameras. Just the chance to pick up a few groceries before heading back to her apartment. Berkeley and Row, the upscale organic supermarket, sat at the end of the avenue like a sleek glass monument to wealth. Inside, everything sparkled with polished perfection. Fruits arranged like artwork, music playing softly overhead. Everything about the store whispered class and exclusivity. When Jasmine stepped through the sliding doors, she was greeted by lavender-scented air and cold stares. A few heads turned. A woman in designer boots glanced over Jasmine's clothes with a raised brow. An older man stepped aside, holding his briefcase a little tighter. Jasmine didn't react. She had experienced this kind of silent judgment her whole life, the kind that doesn't say anything directly but speaks volumes through body language. She just wanted to buy grapes. She reached for a bag, comparing red and green when she noticed it. Two uniformed police officers watching her from the end of the aisle. Their eyes locked on her like she was a threat. No one else. Just her. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. Jasmine took a breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the shopping cart handle. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing suspicious. She had walked in, picked out fruit, and yet now, two officers stood still like statues at the edge of the produce section, their eyes unmoving. The taller one began to speak softly to his partner, who responded with a grin that wasn't friendly. She could tell they had already made up their minds about her. Jasmine looked around the aisle. A young woman holding strawberries pulled out her phone, not to call for help, but to begin recording. She wasn't defending Jasmine. She was preparing to capture a moment she believed might escalate. To her, this was entertainment. A store manager emerged from the nearby service door. He was thin, neatly dressed, and already frowning. His steps were quick but controlled as he approached the officers. "We've had a report," the manager began, his voice low and full of pretense. "A customer loitering, making others uncomfortable, possibly casing the store." Jasmine turned slowly, her gaze firm and clear. "I've been here 10 minutes, she said. "I have a parking receipt on my phone. I was comparing fruit." The officers stepped closer. "We'll need to see some identification," the tall one said, voice stern. "I'll get it," Jasmine replied, reaching calmly into her coat pocket. Before her fingers even touched her wallet, the younger officer moved in and grabbed her wrist, not forcefully but enough to send a message. Her other hand dropped the bag of grapes, which hit the floor and burst open. "Don't resist," the taller officer warned. "I haven't," Jasmine said, still calm, but her voice now louder, drawing attention from shoppers nearby. The supermarket grew silent, but no one spoke. No one stepped forward. Jasmine stood still as the officer tightened his grip on her wrist. She did not fight back, but the gesture alone sent a ripple of judgment through the surrounding shoppers. Some stepped back, others whispered behind their hands. A child nearby tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked softly, "Mom, is that lady a criminal?" The mother simply pulled her daughter away without a word. The store manager cleared his throat, pretending to maintain control. "She is not cooperating," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I was shopping," Jasmine replied, now fully facing the officers. Her voice remained steady. "You can review the camera footage." "There is no need for that," the tall officer snapped. "You're being detained for suspicious behavior. You'll answer questions downtown." And with that, the younger officer reached for his cuffs. The cold metal clamped around Jasmine's wrists with a loud click, louder than necessary, as if meant to send a message to everyone watching. Gasps could be heard. "She didn't even do anything," a young man muttered under his breath, but no one else spoke. Jasmine was led down the aisle, her hands restrained, her shoulders straight. Each step echoed like a warning. Her old cloth bag, the one that read, "Speak truth even if your voice shakes," was left on the floor, grapes rolling across the tile, juice staining the white floor. As she passed the checkout counters, heads turned away. Some shoppers stared into shelves, pretending not to see. At the front of the store, a young woman holding a shopping basket took out her phone. She pressed record. Her hands trembled slightly. This was not the first time someone had been humiliated like this, but it might be the last time the world would let it pass unnoticed. Jasmine reached the glass doors. The cold wind outside touched her face as if trying to remind her who she was, and the officers still had no idea. The black and white patrol car pulled up to a dull brick building tucked behind a faded gas station. Precinct 42 was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no crowds, no buzz of activity, no body cameras blinking red. It was as if the place had been designed to stay forgotten. Jasmine sat in the back seat, her wrists still cuffed. She stared out the window, watching as the world outside slowly disappeared behind reinforced glass. When the car stopped, neither officer said a word. They opened the door and she stepped out, her boots clicking softly against the concrete. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old paper. Fluorescent lights flickered above a worn linoleum floor. The walls were yellowed from age and neglect. There was no booking process, no rights read. A woman at the front desk looked up, saw Jasmine, and nodded toward a hallway. "She's one of them?" she asked. The tall officer shrugged. "Maybe. She gave us attitude." Jasmine was led down the hallway, past empty offices and closed doors. No one asked her name, no one checked her ID. The room they placed her in had no windows. A single wooden chair sat under a buzzing light. The cuffs stayed on. A man in plain clothes walked in. He wore a badge, but no name tag. He looked at Jasmine for a long moment, then sat across from her, silent. "You're not going to ask me anything?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "No need. This one is already being handled." He stood up and walked out. Jasmine sat alone in the room, her wrists aching, but her mind was awake, alive, alert, every detail etched into memory, every movement recorded in her head. She wasn't just a woman in cuffs, she was a congresswoman, and what she had just seen was not sloppy work. It was a machine designed to erase people like her. But this machine had just made its worst mistake. An hour passed, maybe more. The fluorescent light above Jasmine flickered again and again, the soft hum matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her wrists were sore, her back stiff from the wooden chair. Still, she waited. She heard voices outside, a printer clicking, a phone ringing, laughter. They didn't know who she was, and that was exactly what she needed. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, angling her head toward the hallway. From the narrow slit at the bottom of the door, she could see the shadow of someone walking away. The desk phone on the small table across the room had been left behind. It was now or never. She stood, her cuffs limiting movement, but she moved quietly. The phone was old, analog, no passcode. She pressed the buttons with the side of her knuckle. She dialed a number she had memorized years ago, one reserved for emergencies. The line rang once, then again, then a voice. "Office of the Attorney General," said the woman on the other end. Jasmine inhaled slowly. "Patch me through to Jeremiah. Tell him it's Jasmine." The woman hesitated. "Jasmine Crockett?" "Yes," Jasmine said calmly. "He will want to take this." There was silence, then a faint click, then a voice she knew better than anyone. "Jazz," said Jeremiah Crockett, her older brother. His tone changed instantly from surprise to command. "Where are you?" "Precinct 42, she whispered. "They arrested me. No charges, no camera. They think I'm no one." His voice became steel. "Are you safe?" "For now, but it's bigger than me. They're erasing things. This goes higher than just 2 officers." "Say no more," Jeremiah said. Another pause. "I'll take it from here." The line went dead. Jasmine placed the phone back gently. She returned to her seat. Calm again. In less than an hour, the weight of the United States Department of Justice would descend upon this forgotten place. They had picked the wrong woman, and now the entire system would feel the consequence. At exactly 3:06 p.m., the sound of distant engines echoed through the quiet streets outside Precinct 42. It started with a low rumble, almost unnoticeable at first. Then it grew louder. A convoy of black SUVs turned the corner. Each vehicle was unmarked, but their presence spoke volumes. Tactical teams in dark uniforms emerged swiftly, moving with purpose. Their boots struck the pavement in unison. No words, no chaos, just pure coordination. Inside the precinct, the hum of normalcy shattered. Detective Harris stood at the coffee machine when the first alert came in through his radio. "Federal response incoming. Repeat. Federal response incoming." His face went pale. Captain Whitman rushed from his office, tie loosened, eyes wild. "What is this?" he barked. "Who called them?" No one answered. By the time he reached the front lobby, the federal team was already inside. They presented sealed warrants. Legal, final, unquestionable. "We are here for Jasmine Crockett," said Agent Monroe, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that silenced the room. "And we are taking full control of this facility under federal mandate." "You can't just walk in here," Whitman snapped, trying to hold on to whatever power he had left. Agent Monroe didn't blink. "We already did." At the back of the building, Jasmine heard footsteps, but this time they were not slow and heavy like Mitchell's. They were fast, determined. The door opened. 2 agents entered, their expressions neutral but respectful. One gently unlocked the cuffs from her wrists. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are safe now." Jasmine stood slowly, her joints aching from the long hours of stillness. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded. "Do you have everything you need?" the agent asked. "Yes," Jasmine replied softly. "Everything I need is already here." As they led her out, every officer she passed looked away. No more laughter, no more arrogance, only silence. Outside the air was cooler, the wind had shifted, and across the city from boardrooms to newsrooms the first tremors of reckoning had begun. Jasmine stepped into the afternoon light, her face calm, her back straight. Her wrists still bore faint red marks from the cuffs, but her eyes had never looked sharper. A crowd had begun to gather across the street. No reporters yet, but whispers filled the air. People filming on their phones, mothers holding their children's hands tighter. A few familiar faces from her district stood silently, watching with disbelief. One woman in the crowd, an elderly librarian Jasmine once fought for during budget cuts, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. "That's Jasmine Crockett," someone murmured. Jasmine paused at the sidewalk, scanning the faces. Some looked down, ashamed they had watched her taken without saying a word. Others stared in awe, no longer because she was a congresswoman, but because she had endured, and now she stood tall. A federal agent opened the door of the lead vehicle. Before getting in, Jasmine turned to the crowd. Her voice was steady. "I do not need applause. I do not need sympathy." A pause. "I need you to remember that this happened. I need you to remember how silence lets systems like this survive." The crowd was silent. "And I need you to understand that the fight for justice is not mine alone. It is yours too." Someone in the crowd began clapping, then another. Then a wave of hands came together in thunderous rhythm, not because it was over, but because it had just begun. Inside the SUV, Jasmine sat between 2 agents, her hands rested calmly in her lap. One agent offered her water. She took it politely. "Where to next, ma'am?" She turned to look out the window. "To the courthouse. I have a statement to deliver." Back in the precinct, the halls were being cleared, records seized, officers questioned. Captain Whitman was in handcuffs now, red-faced and silent. Mitchell sat on a bench with his head bowed, no longer the predator. Outside, the convoy pulled away, disappearing into the city. But the impact remained. Jasmine's image, walking out of that building, head held high, would become the most shared clip in the country within hours. The woman they tried to erase had become the symbol no one could ignore. The next morning, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was surrounded by a quiet intensity. No chaos, no protests. Just an air of expectation so thick it could be felt in every step. Inside, the courtroom was filled long before proceedings began. Senators, civil rights lawyers, law students and journalists sat shoulder to shoulder. The names on the docket were already making headlines. Captain Raymond Whitman, Officer Brad Mitchell, Officer Kyle Harris, and Administrator Sylvia Turner. They were all being charged with abuse of authority, destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to cover up civil rights violations. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at the witness table. She wore no blazer, no congressional pin, just a dark suit and a white blouse. Her natural hair was tied back in a simple twist. No jewelry, no makeup, only a small notebook in front of her with handwritten notes and one folded letter from her late mother. When the judge called her name, the room fell still. Cameras rolled silently, and even the clicking of keyboards slowed. Jasmine stood and walked to the witness stand. Her voice was soft but carried through the room with precision. "I was arrested because I looked like I did not belong, not because I did anything wrong." She recounted every step, from the way Officer Mitchell approached her to the cold snap of the handcuffs, from the silence of bystanders to the indifference of the precinct. She described what she saw in that surveillance room, the deletion of files, the manipulation of data, the laughter behind closed doors. They assumed I had no one, that I was no one. A pause. And that is where they made their mistake. The defense attorney shifted in his seat. The judge leaned forward. Journalists scribbled furiously. "I'm not here as a congresswoman," Jasmine said. "I'm here as a witness to a system that believes silence is safety. But silence protects no one. It only builds walls around injustice." From the back of the room, someone whispered, "She's telling it exactly how it happened." Jasmine looked at the officers seated across from her. "You wore badges that gave you authority, but not permission to break the law, and definitely not the right to erase my humanity." No one moved, no one breathed. The truth had been spoken in the clearest voice possible, and the system, for the first time in a long time, was forced to listen. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had begun to gather. They came from different places and backgrounds. Teachers, veterans, small business owners, students, clergy members, even former officers. Many held handmade signs. Some simply stood in silence, watching the screen that had been set up to display the live testimony. Back inside, the defense attempted to challenge Jasmine's credibility. "You remembered too much," one attorney said, trying to cast doubt. "Too many details. Is it even possible for a person to recall every minute of such an event?" Jasmine smiled gently, not mockingly, not angrily, just calmly. "When you are being humiliated publicly, you remember. When you are silenced in a room where no one speaks for you, you remember. When the cold metal of a handcuff touches your skin for no reason, that memory does not fade." The judge said nothing. She simply nodded for Jasmine to continue. Jasmine then revealed a copy of the surveillance system logs. She had remembered the screen interface, the timestamps, and even the color coding of the deleted files. Her attorneys had matched her account with the Federal Digital Recovery Team's findings. The records had been deleted exactly as she described at the time she recalled. Then came the surprise no one expected. Jordan Carter, the journalism student, walked into the courtroom holding a flash drive. "I recorded the arrest," he said. "They told me to delete it, but I made a backup." The footage was played. There it was. Clear, undeniable. Officer Mitchell grabbing Jasmine's arm, Officer Harris slapping the handcuffs on her wrist. The supermarket manager standing idly by. Jasmine never resisted, not once. The courtroom was silent, but this time the silence held weight. Not fear, not doubt, but the heaviness of truth landing all at once. The judge looked at the officers. "This court sees no justification for the arrest, nor for the actions that followed." Jasmine turned toward the gallery, meeting Jordan's eyes. "You didn't look away," she said, "and because of that, the truth lives." It was no longer just about her. This was bigger than one wrongful arrest. This was about how quickly a system can erase someone when it believes no one will notice. But now the world was watching, and the silence had finally been broken. The following morning, the streets outside the federal courthouse were lined with people. Some held candles, others clutched their children's hands. A few carried photographs of loved ones who had been mistreated, arrested, or forgotten in the same system Jasmine had just stood against. Inside the courtroom, the judge's bench stood tall, its polished wood reflecting the quiet tension in the room. Everyone was present. Officer Mitchell, eyes sunken and pale, sat next to Harris, whose posture no longer had its former arrogance. Chief Callahan leaned forward, sweating beneath the courtroom lights. On the other side, Judge Whitaker and Mayor Kensington waited, surrounded by their lawyers and silence. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. "This court has reviewed the testimonies, the video evidence, and the records that were nearly destroyed," she began. "And it finds that what occurred was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a coordinated pattern of abuse, concealment, and systemic discrimination." Jasmine sat in the front row, her expression unreadable. The judge turned toward Mitchell and Harris. "You are hereby found guilty of unlawful arrest, falsification of records, and abuse of power under federal law." Harris dropped his head. Mitchell clenched his fists. "To Chief Callahan, your silence and complicity allowed these violations to persist. You failed in your duty. You are also found guilty." She turned to Judge Whitaker and Mayor Kensington. "You used your influence to protect misconduct, suppress investigations, and intimidate witnesses. Your actions weaken public trust in justice itself. The court finds you guilty of obstruction and conspiracy." Not a sound moved in the room. The gavel came down once. "This court recommends maximum sentencing for all involved." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Tears welled in the eyes of some attendees. Jasmine closed her eyes, letting out a slow breath. She wasn't smiling. There was no satisfaction in watching people fall, but there was relief in seeing truth stand taller than power for once. The judge stood. "One final note," she said. "This ruling is not the end. It is a beginning where silence is no longer tolerated." Outside, as news crews prepared their evening reports and families hugged in quiet solidarity, the door opened and Jasmine stepped outside into the soft morning light. And for the first time in a long time, justice had a face, and it looked like her. Outside the courthouse, a quiet tension filled the air. The trial had ended, but the story was far from over. Jasmine stood at the top of the courthouse steps, not with a fist raised in victory, but with a steady calm. Dozens of reporters shouted her name, their cameras flashing non-stop. Her face was on every news screen, but she made no effort to speak, not yet. A few feet away, Jeremiah Crockett gave her space. He had fought in the courtroom, but this moment belonged to Jasmine alone. The public wanted answers. They wanted drama. But Jasmine gave them something else. She gave them silence. A silence that demanded reflection. Then she stepped forward, slowly, and raised a single piece of paper in her hand. It was a copy of the report she had written after her release from Precinct 18. It was worn at the corners, marked with notes in the margins, a document that had grown heavier with every truth it carried. "I was never supposed to make it to this microphone," she said, her voice clear and even. "They thought I would walk away quietly. They thought fear would win." She paused, letting the words land. "But fear only grows in silence, and I am done being silent." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jasmine raised her hand. The noise settled. "This case is not just about me. It is about every man, every woman, every child who's been stopped, questioned, or judged because they looked out of place. It is about a system that protects itself by erasing the voices it should uplift." She turned slightly, gesturing to the building behind her. "They called this justice. I call it a warning." Then she looked out at the crowd and asked a question no one expected. "How many more are we willing to lose before we admit the system needs more than reform? It needs a reckoning." Her words carried down the street, across the city, and into the homes of people who had never paid attention before. Some felt a sting of recognition, others shame, but all felt something shift. In the silence that followed, an older woman in the crowd, her eyes wet with tears, whispered, "Finally, someone said it." Jasmine walked down the steps, not like a politician, but like a messenger of something larger than herself. Change did not walk with her, it followed in her footsteps. 1 month later, the building once known as Precinct 18 stood behind tall fences, its windows boarded, its signs removed. A large banner hung across the chain-link fence in front of it. It read, "Closed for federal investigation," but this wasn't the end of the story. Inside a renovated community hall just 4 blocks away, something new was beginning. Jasmine Crockett sat in a circle with 15 young people, most of them teenagers from the local high school. There were no cameras, no reporters, just folding chairs, notebooks, and quiet focus. She held up a small, laminated card. On it were 5 simple lines. 1. Ask questions. 2. Know your rights. 3. Speak clearly. 4. Record everything. 5. Never assume silence equals safety. "These," she said, "are not just rules for staying safe. They are tools for staying free." One student, a tall boy with a nervous voice, asked, "But what if they still don't listen to us?" Jasmine nodded slowly. "That's when you speak louder, not with your voice, but with truth, with action, with proof. That's why you document, why you connect, why you never walk alone." The boy nodded. The others leaned in. Each of these students had seen the video of her arrest. Some of them had parents who were afraid to go to the police. Some had older siblings with records they didn't deserve, but now they were sitting across from someone who had made the system answer for its silence. This wasn't just a workshop. It was training for a generation that refused to look away. Later that afternoon, Jasmine met with Lisa Carter, the only officer at Precinct 18, who had dared to submit an internal report against her colleagues. Lisa now worked as the community liaison for the Federal Oversight Board. "I still feel guilty," Lisa said, "for staying quiet for so long." Jasmine looked her in the eye. But you didn't stay silent forever. That's what matters." They sat for a moment, both women quiet, both remembering how far they had come. In the corner of the room, a new mural was being painted by local artists. It showed a woman standing between two buildings. One was dark, crumbling, labelled System. The other was bright, open, labelled Justice. And in the woman's hand was not a weapon but a book, the Constitution. The caption beneath read, "Truth is not a moment, it is a movement." Jasmine stepped back and looked at it with a small smile. She knew this was only the beginning, because systems break down in silence, but they can be rebuilt through memory, courage, and one person brave enough to say no more. The following week, a quiet but powerful moment unfolded at the city courthouse. A public hearing was held to address the systemic misconduct exposed by Jasmine's case. For the first time in years, victims of wrongful arrest, racial profiling, and intimidation by local law enforcement were given a platform to speak. Jasmine sat in the second row, not as the star witness this time, but as a silent supporter. One by one they stepped up. A teenage girl with shaking hands told the room how she was searched without reason on her way home from school. A father described how his son had been held overnight without a call to his lawyer. An elderly woman whispered into the microphone about the time she had reported an officer's behavior only to have her complaint disappear. Then came Jordan Carter. He approached the podium in a navy jacket, holding the same phone he had used that day in the supermarket. "I was just a kid with groceries," he said, "but I knew what I saw, and I knew that if I didn't record it, it would vanish like all the other stories we pretend not to see." The room fell still. He lifted his phone and played the video again. The image appeared on a large screen behind him. Jasmine, handcuffed, being led through the produce aisle. The cold stares, the silence, the weight of the moment. "This is not just about her," Jordan continued. "It's about all of us, about how easy it is for a system to swallow people whole, but not this time, because one person said enough, and because that one moment woke the rest of us up." Applause broke out, not loud or explosive, but steady and heartfelt. After the hearing, a reporter approached Jasmine. "What do you hope happens next?" she asked. Jasmine thought for a long moment before answering. "I hope that from now on, people stop confusing silence with peace, that they stop thinking injustice only matters when it happens to them, and that they understand real change starts when everyday people begin to care about what they used to ignore." The reporter lowered her pen, visibly moved. Outside the courthouse, a group of students stood holding handmade signs. One read, "We saw what you did. We remember." Another simply said, "Jasmine made them see us." A few steps away, Lisa Carter stood beside them, clipboard in hand, signing volunteers up for a new watchdog program. Her voice was calm but focused as she explained legal rights and how to report abuse. She was no longer an officer hiding in the background. She was a voice of accountability. That day the courthouse didn't feel like a cold institution of walls and verdicts. It felt like something human, something possible. Because when truth walks in with no badge, no title, and no pretense, people begin to listen, and when they do, the system is never the same again. A few months later, something unexpected happened. A local high school invited Jasmine to speak. It was not a grand event, no press, no cameras, just a group of teenagers in a plain auditorium with folding chairs and a dusty stage. Jasmine hesitated at first. She had spoken in courtrooms and on national television, but this felt different. This was intimate, personal. She stood on the stage in front of 100 students, no podium, no speech prepared. "I was handcuffed because I looked like someone who didn't belong," she began, "but I stayed calm because I knew who I was." The students watched, quiet and attentive. "I know some of you feel the same every time you walk into a store and someone watches you, or when you're told to lower your voice just because it sounds too confident. I know what that feels like, and I'm here to tell you that you don't have to change who you are to be worthy of respect." A hand rose in the back. "How did you not lose your mind in there?" a boy asked. Jasmine smiled softly. "I reminded myself that their version of me was a lie. I knew the truth, and that truth gave me more strength than any badge or handcuff ever could." After the talk, the students lined up to thank her. One girl handed Jasmine a sketch she had drawn of the moment Jasmine walked out of the precinct. Jasmine in cuffs, head held high, eyes forward, a symbol of quiet power. Jasmine held the drawing with care. Later that day, as she walked past a neighborhood mural, she stopped. It had been updated. The once blank wall now showed scenes from the supermarket, the precinct, and the courtroom. At the center stood Jasmine, not as a politician or even a symbol, but as a woman walking calmly while others judged her. Around her, words had been painted in bold white letters. They thought she was nobody. She reminded them she was everybody. Just beneath it, in smaller script, someone had added, "Truth walks in silence, but it leaves echoes that never fade." Jasmine stood there for a long while, her coat wrapped tight against the wind. A little boy passing by tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Is that her?" His mother nodded. "Yes, baby, that's the lady who made them listen." Jasmine turned slightly, gave a warm nod and walked on. She didn't need applause, she didn't need another headline. She had changed something bigger than policy. She had changed the way people saw themselves, and in the quiet ripple of that change, a movement had begun. Not loud, not flashy, but certain, and it would not be stopped. 6 months later, the United States Department of Justice released its full investigative report. The title was simple: Precinct 18 and the Machinery of Silence. The findings were devastating. Over 2 decades of falsified records, dozens of deleted surveillance videos, hundreds of complaints dismissed, patterns of racial targeting, particularly of Black and Latino citizens. A system built not to protect, but to insulate those in power. The report led to a nationwide audit of police precincts and local courts. Other systems began to crack. Precincts that had long stood as untouchable institutions were now forced into the light, but the real legacy was not in policy shifts. It was in the way people talked. In community centres, churches, schools and barbershops, people spoke Jasmine's name not as a hero, but as a reminder. A reminder that one woman standing alone can make an entire building of power shake. A month after the report's release, Jasmine was offered a seat on a major national oversight board. She declined. Instead, she founded a quiet space, a small non-profit named the Still Voice Initiative. Its purpose: teach people how to document injustice, how to navigate the legal system, and most importantly, how to reclaim their voice. She called it a home for those who never had one inside the system. Jasmine taught classes herself. She met with survivors of wrongful arrests, helped kids understand their rights, and mentored new lawyers who wanted to do more than just win cases. She told them, "You're not here to win arguments, you're here to build trust where it's been broken." One afternoon, as she closed up after a long workshop, she noticed a small envelope on her desk. No return address, just her name written in block letters. Inside was a photo. It showed her standing in the supermarket aisle, handcuffed. Next to it was a note. "You didn't scream, you didn't beg, but I saw you." It was signed only "One of them." Jasmine folded the note, placed it inside her journal, and smiled to herself because she understood what it meant. Sometimes the loudest transformations happen in silence. Sometimes even the people who once looked away come back quietly, changed, and so she kept going. Teaching, listening, helping people rebuild their sense of worth, one story at a time. Not as a congresswoman, not even as a survivor, but simply as someone who refused to forget. And in that refusal, she became more than a figure in a courtroom. She became proof that dignity, once stripped, can still be reclaimed, and truth, once buried, always finds a way back to the surface. The story of Jasmine Crockett no longer belonged to her alone. It became something larger, something that echoed in places far beyond the courthouse or the supermarket aisle. Her name was now written into textbooks used in civics classes. Teachers used her testimony to explain how systems of power can both fail and be held accountable. In an elementary school in Minneapolis, a group of 5th graders read her story aloud during Black History Month. When asked what they learned, one small boy stood up and said, "That justice doesn't wear a badge, it walks in your shoes when you don't give up." Jasmine received letters from across the country. Some came from young girls inspired to study law. Others came from retired officers who admitted that they once ignored things they shouldn't have. A few came anonymously, offering apologies. She read every one. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in her non-profit center, she found the cloth bag she had carried that day in the supermarket. It was faded now, the fabric thinning at the seams, but the words were still clear. "Speak truth even if your voice shakes." She held the bag to her chest for a moment and then placed it inside a glass case in the lobby of the center, right next to a framed copy of the federal ruling that dismantled the system at Precinct 18. Visitors would often pause there, reading the quote, feeling the weight of the silence it had once broken. A young intern asked her one day, "Do you think we'll ever fix the whole system?" Jasmine smiled, her voice low but steady. "No system stays perfect. But when people stop being afraid to speak, it gets harder for those in power to hide. The intern nodded, inspired, and Jasmine patted her on the shoulder. It's not about fixing everything. It's about making sure the next person doesn't walk through what I did and feel alone. The Community Justice Centre continued to grow. More volunteers joined. Local law schools sent students to learn real advocacy. Retired judges offered pro bono guidance. Victims of wrongful convictions received assistance to rebuild their lives. And at the centre of it all was Jasmine, not as a symbol, not as a politician, but as a constant, a steady voice reminding the world that silence is not the same as peace, and that the moment you choose to see, really see, the injustice around you, you become part of the resistance against it. She didn't carry a title anymore, but in every conversation, every workshop, every small act of truth-telling that rippled outward, Jasmine Crockett remained what she had always been, a witness, a survivor, a force of quiet, unshakable justice. Years passed, but the echoes of that single hour Jasmine spent in handcuffs never faded. It had become more than a memory. It was now a blueprint, a guide for how to resist, how to speak, and how to reclaim dignity when the world tries to strip it away. The Eleanor Community Justice Centre, once a symbol of darkness and abuse, had fully transformed. The glass walls reflected sunlight now, not shadows. Inside, murals of everyday heroes stretched across long corridors. One wall showed a young girl standing alone in a courtroom, her hand raised in testimony. Another depicted a boy holding a phone, capturing truth with courage. Jasmine walked those halls often. Not as a director, not even as a mentor. She walked them as a presence, silent but undeniable, reminding every visitor that justice is not a moment, but a movement. Every month she hosted a night class simply titled Truth and Power. The room held no more than 20 chairs. There were no grades, no certificates, no lectures, just conversations. She listened to a young mother speak about being stopped and searched in front of her children. She listened to a former officer describe the guilt of remaining silent during his early years in uniform. And she listened to teenagers, too young to vote but old enough to feel the sting of suspicion in stores and streets. She always ended the session the same way. Not with advice, but with a question. What would it take for you to stop being silent the next time you see someone else being mistreated? It made people pause. Sometimes they answered right away, sometimes they didn't, but they always came back the next week. One evening, a boy no older than 15 approached her after class. His voice trembled as he spoke. "My brother, he was arrested 2 months ago. I want to tell his story. I want people to hear it, but I don't know how." Jasmine nodded. "You don't have to start big," she said gently. "Just start true." He looked at her, unsure. She added, "Stories don't change the world because they are loud. They change the world because they are real. That's what scares people who try to silence us. Not our voices, but our truth." The boy left with a notebook that night and returned the following week with the first draft of his brother's story. Jasmine read it carefully, and for the first time in a long time she cried, not from pain, but from hope. Because in that small room, a new generation was already learning the one lesson Jasmine Crockett had lived to teach. Truth is the beginning of every revolution. The courtroom was still echoing from the last testimony. The weight of every word that had been spoken in the previous hours had settled into the silence like dust. Jasmine Crockett sat calmly at the witness stand. Her hands were folded, and her voice had grown quieter, but no less firm. Across the room, the 3 accused men sat behind their defense table. They no longer carried the proud posture of untouchable officials. Their eyes, once sharp and judgmental, now flickered nervously each time Jasmine spoke. The judge leaned forward slightly and cleared her throat. "Miss Crockett, the court has heard your account. Is there anything else you wish to say before we proceed?" Jasmine looked directly at her, then at the jury, then to the crowd seated behind the wooden rails. Her voice, soft but steady, carried through the air with clarity. "I want to say this for the young girl who watched from aisle 7 with a question in her eyes that no one answered, for the student who dared to press record, for every person who walked away not because they did not care, but because they thought no one would believe them." She paused and then added with calm intensity, "They were wrong. We are not invisible, we are not voiceless, and we are not alone anymore." A soft murmur moved through the courtroom. No one dared interrupt her. Jasmine turned to face the accused directly. "You judged me based on what you saw in a moment. My clothes, my skin, my silence. But justice is not built on first impressions. It is built on truth. and the truth has never needed a fancy suit to be real." The prosecutor gave a subtle nod of admiration. Jasmine stepped down from the stand and walked back to her seat. As she passed the defense table, Callahan shifted uncomfortably. Kensington avoided eye contact. Whitaker's fingers tapped nervously against the wood, and in that moment, Jasmine knew she had already won something larger than the trial. Outside the courthouse, the skies remained grey, but within the walls of the courtroom something had shifted. A new weight had replaced the old silence, a weight of accountability, and the final verdict was still to come. The jury had been deliberating for hours. The courtroom remained packed, no one daring to leave their seat. The air was thick with anticipation. Even outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Some held signs, others simply stood in silence, waiting for the outcome that could change everything. Jasmine sat quietly in the front row, her hands resting on her lap. Jeremiah stood nearby, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He had fought many legal battles in his life, but this one felt personal in a way nothing else ever had. When the side door finally opened and the jury filed in, the atmosphere shifted. A soft rustling moved through the room as every person leaned forward. The presiding judge looked up. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman with tightly held papers stood. "We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." She cleared her throat. "In the matter of the People versus Robert Callahan, we find the defendant guilty on all charges." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some people nodded, others covered their mouths. Jasmine remained still, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. "In the matter of the People versus William Whitaker, we find the defendant guilty on all charges." A pause followed, longer this time. Whitaker closed his eyes. "In the matter of the People versus James Kensington, we find the defendant guilty on all charges." Silence settled once more, but this time it was not heavy with fear. It was filled with release. For many, it felt like justice had finally arrived. Long delayed, but undeniable. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then she turned to the courtroom. "Sentencing will be announced in a separate hearing, but let this be known. The court acknowledges the bravery of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and the integrity of every citizen who stepped forward. This trial has exposed not only individuals but an entire system, and that system will now answer for what it has allowed to happen." As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jasmine stayed seated for a few minutes longer. The weight of the moment, the weight of the truth, pressed gently on her shoulders. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a torch. She stood, looked around one last time, and walked toward the exit with quiet strength. She had not just won a case, she had changed a system. Weeks passed, but the impact of the verdict did not fade. News channels ran special reports. Social media flooded with hashtags. Community leaders, lawmakers, and educators began quoting Jasmine's courtroom testimony in speeches and classrooms across the country. But Jasmine herself did not seek attention. She returned quietly to her district, to the community center she had helped build years ago. She spent her days teaching, listening, and mentoring. Young people lined up to speak with her, not because she was a congresswoman, but because she had stood up when the world expected her to stay silent. One afternoon, a young girl approached her after a workshop. "Miss Crockett, I saw you on the news. I want to be like you when I grow up." Jasmine smiled gently. "No," she said softly. "Be better. Speak louder. Fight sooner." In Washington, Jeremiah was working around the clock. The federal reforms initiated from the trial findings were now being drafted into national legislation. A new oversight division was formed, with full investigative power over precincts, judges, and municipal leadership. Precinct 18 was officially dissolved. In its place, a new building opened with a new name, the Eleanor Justice Center, a symbol of transparency, education, and community healing. No holding cells, instead classrooms, counseling rooms, a legal aid office, and on one wall, a mural. The mural showed a black woman standing in the rain. Her wrists were free, her back straight, and behind her a crowd of people rising. Above her a single phrase, "Truth cannot be handcuffed." Jordan Carter, the student journalist who recorded the incident, had now become a reporter for a national investigative outlet. His work focused on wrongful arrests and civil rights abuses. In a televised interview, he said, "That day in the supermarket, I thought I was just recording a moment, but it turned out to be a movement. And Jasmine, she never ran for higher office. She never wrote a memoir or signed a book deal. She simply kept showing up at town halls, in classrooms, at quiet corners of protest lines, sometimes alone, often with others, but always with the same message. Change is not loud, it is consistent, and every time she stood before a microphone, a crowd, or even just one scared young girl who felt invisible in the world, she remembered the moment her cuffs were removed, and she made sure no one ever forgot what truth looked like when it stood its ground. It did not end in a courtroom, it did not end with a news headline. Jasmine Crockett's story became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a living curriculum. In public schools, her testimony was read aloud during civics lessons. In precincts across the country, new officers were trained using a case study titled, "What Happens When Power Forgets Humanity?" In one small town in Georgia, a fifth-grade boy stood during a class discussion and said, "Justice is when someone like Miss Jasmine gets treated right before they have to fight for it." That sentiment rippled across generations. The Eleanor Justice Center began hosting monthly events called Voices Unforgotten, where survivors of discrimination shared their stories, and every voice was recorded, archived, and preserved. It became the largest oral history project on modern civil rights reform in the country. Lisa Carter, now the National Director for Civilian Oversight, would often say in interviews, "Jasmine didn't just expose a system, she lit a torch so others could walk through it." As for Jordan Carter, now an award-winning journalist, he returned one day to the supermarket where everything began. The glass doors had been replaced, the aisles rearranged, but in the corner where Jasmine once stood, he placed a framed photo. It showed a single pair of handcuffs, opened. A small plaque underneath read, "The moment we chose not to look away." And in a quiet classroom in Dallas, Jasmine Crockett still teaches twice a week. No security detail, no podium, just a whiteboard and a room full of curious minds. She ends each class with one question: who protects justice when justice is asleep? The answers vary, but the lesson is always the same. The truth is not loud, it is patient, it remembers, it waits, and when someone finally dares to speak, it rises. That is Jasmine Crockett's legacy, not of fame, but of memory, and of a courage that could not be handcuffed.